The city had no name anymore, not on maps, not in records, not in the mouths of men who survived it. But once, before Rome decided it should never be remembered, it was alive. It breathed through narrow streets of stone and dust, through markets that smelled of olive oil and sweat, through the laughter of children who ran between columns older than their fathers. It was not a powerful city. It did not command armies or shape empires. It existed quietly, stubbornly, on the edge of a Roman road that brought merchants one season and soldiers the next. And that was its mistake. Rome did not always destroy cities with fire. Sometimes it destroyed them with silence. Sometimes it erased them so completely that history itself forgot to ask what had been lost. The decision was made in a marble chamber hundreds of miles away. No one in the city heard the words spoken that sealed their fate. No one saw the ink dry on the orders that turned their homes into an absence. Power did not announce itself. It simply moved. When the Roman column appeared on the horizon, it did not look like death. It looked like order, shields glinting in the sun, banners standing tall, armor polished with discipline. The city's elders stood on the walls and convinced themselves that this was another inspection, another demand for tax, another reminder of who ruled the world. Rome had come before. Rome had taken grain, men, obedience. Rome had never taken memory. Not yet. The gates opened without a fight. That would later be remembered as their second mistake. The Roman commander entered the city riding a black horse that moved slowly, deliberately, as if it already knew the streets were no longer meant to exist. His eyes did not wander. He did not look impressed or threatened. He looked satisfied, as if he were walking into something that had been prepared for him long ago. There were no speeches, no negotiations, no warnings shouted from balconies. Only a single order, spoken quietly. By nightfall, the city would be gone, not burned, not conquered, erased. The first thing Rome killed was movement. Soldiers sealed every road. No one left. No one entered. The city became a closed breath, a trapped pulse. Panic did not rise immediately. People believed this was temporary. Rome always demanded something before it destroyed. This time there was no demand. Then came the separation. Men were taken from their homes first, pulled into the streets with no explanation. Fathers, sons, brothers. Not chained, not beaten, just removed, calmly, efficiently, as if they were being relocated rather than eliminated. Women watched from doorways, holding children whose cries felt too loud for the stillness forming around them. The air thickened. The city sensed its own ending before its people did. By sunset, the streets were empty of men. By nightfall, the screams began, not from the city, from beyond it. Rome did not kill them inside the walls. That would leave evidence. Bodies are remembered. Graves become history. Rome was not writing history. It was deleting it. The city slept knowing something had gone wrong, but not yet understanding how completely it had already been lost. In the darkness, torches lined the outer roads. No sound returned from where the men had been taken. No footsteps, no voices, no proof that they still existed. When dawn arrived, the city was already a grave. It just did not know it yet, and Rome was only beginning. The survivors were scattered like ash without fire. Rome did not place them together. That would preserve memory. That would allow language to survive, and with language, identity. Instead, families were separated at every crossing. Mothers were sent east, sons south, daughters west. Husbands disappeared into military labor camps. Children were absorbed into households that spoke different tongues and worshiped different gods. Within one generation, the city was gone not just from land, but from blood. At night, some of them tried to speak its name to themselves, but the name began to feel dangerous, as if remembering was an act of rebellion, as if even thought could be punished. So they learned to stay silent, even inside their own minds. Rome had not taken their lives. It had taken their right to exist. Decades passed. Roads were built where the city had once stood. Merchants traveled over the buried streets without knowing what lay beneath their wheels. Soldiers rested where children had once played. No marker, no stone, no whisper of what had been lost, and Rome called it peace. But the earth remembered. It remembered the pressure of walls, the shape of doorways, the warmth of hands that once touched its stones. And slowly it began to speak. It started with a collapse. One winter, heavy rains weakened the soil. A Roman caravan passed over ground that had been compacted too perfectly. The earth gave way beneath a wagon, swallowing it halfway. When soldiers dug to free it, their tools struck something that was not rock. They struck a wall, perfectly preserved, smooth, intentional. The soldiers stared at it in silence. This was not a ruin. This was architecture. This was design. This was a city that should not exist. Rome had failed in one thing: time. Reports were sent to provincial governors. The discovery was dismissed as an abandoned outpost, a forgotten village, nothing worthy of investigation. Rome was not interested in what it had erased. To acknowledge it would be to admit it had ever existed. So the wall was buried again. But now the idea had been planted. Local shepherds began to speak of hollow ground, of echoes beneath their feet, of stones that felt warm in winter and cold in summer. Stories traveled, quiet and uncertain, like smoke without fire. Something was under the land, something that had not been meant to return. Centuries later, Rome itself was gone, its banners torn, its roads claimed by weeds, its language broken into fragments. Empires fall loudly, but erasures fall slowly. The city still buried outlived the power that had destroyed it, and one day, hands that did not belong to Rome touched its walls again, not with fear, not with authority, but with wonder. An excavation began without knowing what it sought. Farmers clearing land uncovered a corner of stone, then a stair, then a street that ran too straight, too deliberate to be natural. The earth opened like a wound that had waited to breathe. They found homes still, L's standing, doorways sealed by ancient hands, rooms frozen in the shape of living. No signs of fire, no signs of war, no signs of abandonment, only absence. The scholars were confused. They searched records, they searched maps, they searched Roman texts that named every city Rome had ever conquered. This one was not there. It was as if the land itself had lied for centuries. They uncovered writing, scraped but not destroyed. Symbols that had been deliberately erased, not vandalized, removed with precision. Someone had wanted this place to be forgotten, not ruined. That realization changed everything, because destruction is rage, but erasure is intention. They understood then that they were not uncovering a lost city. They were uncovering a crime older than memory, committed by an empire that believed even history belonged to it. And for the first time the city was no longer nameless, not because they knew what it had been called, but because they finally understood what it had been. Proof that silence is not absence, it is a weapon, and Rome had wielded it perfectly. The first skeleton was found in a kitchen. It was seated against a wall, knees pulled close to the chest, arms wrapped around what had once been a wooden bowl. The bowl had rotted into darkness, but its shape was still remembered by the bones that held it. Whoever this person had been, they had not died running. They had not died screaming. They had died waiting. The archaeologists stood in silence anew. It, as if noise itself might disturb the moment that had been frozen for nearly 2,000 years. This was not a casualty of war. This was not an accident. This was a person who had been sealed inside a life that was no longer allowed to exist. As more of the city was uncovered, the pattern became undeniable. Bodies were everywhere, in homes, in storerooms, in streets, not in chaos, in stillness. Some were lying on beds, wrapped in the remnants of cloth. Some were gathered in corners, pressed close together. Families had died as families. No wounds, no weapons, no signs of violence, just the slow, suffocating certainty of starvation and airlessness. Rome had not killed them. It had abandoned them inside their own city. The realization struck harder than any evidence of massacre could have. Fire would have meant anger. Blood would have meant conflict. This meant calculation, Someone had decided that letting them fade was cleaner than destroying them openly. This was not conquest. This was administrative extinction. The excavation became a site of mourning. Workers stopped joking. Scholars stopped speaking casually. Each stone removed felt like lifting a lid from a grave that had never been meant to be opened. They began to treat the ground with a respect usually reserved for sacred places. Because it was sacred, not by religion, by injustice, they found a school, small benches carved from stone, slates that had once held lessons. On one wall, scratched faintly into the Sioux face, were shapes that might have been letters. A child's attempt to preserve something, to say, "I was here." That line became the heartbeat of the site. I was here. Rome had tried to make that sentence impossible. They found a temple, not grand, not powerful, a place of quiet devotion. The statues inside had been defaced, their names removed, not smashed, scraped, as if even gods had not been allowed to remember this city. They found a marketplace, stalls still standing, weights still arranged, coins scattered where they had fallen from hands that never returned to collect them. Commerce had stopped mid-breath, and then they found the archive room, a place where the city had once kept its own memory. The shelves were empty, not looted, emptied. The walls showed marks where plaques had been mounted, where lists of names, records of births, marriages, deaths had once been displayed. Someone had stood here and removed the proof of existence piece by piece. That someone had been trained, that someone had been ordered, that someone had been Roman. The excavation reports changed tone. They stopped describing a discovery and started describing an atrocity. Words like forgotten were replaced with erased. Lost was replaced with silenced. The city was no longer an accident of history. It was evidence of a crime that had been hidden too well. News traveled, historians argued, governments hesitated, museums requested control. The site became political. Truth always does. Some did not Rome to be remembered this way. Rome was civilization, law, roads, order. This city threatened the myth. It suggested that the empire's greatest power had not been construction, but deletion. There were attempts to minimize it. An isolated incident, a regional mistake, a misunderstood relocation. But the bodies told a different story. No city chooses to die in silence. No people choose to be forgotten. As more rooms were opened, something else emerged. Messages, scratched into stone, carved into walls, written with trembling hands. Not words that could be read easily. The language had shifted across centuries, but the intent was clear. We are still here. Do not forget us. They closed the doors. One carving stood out, larger, deeper, as if made with the last strength of someone who refused to disappear. It was not a sentence, it was a name, not of the city, of a person. And that was when the story changed again, because erasing a city is powerful, but erasing a person is personal, and someone inside those walls had refused to let Rome finish the job. The name was incomplete. Time had eaten parts of it. Moisture had softened the stone. Earth had pressed against it like a hand trying to push memory back into sleep. But enough remained to feel intentional. Enough remained to prove that this had not been random. It was carved at shoulder height, not hidden, not desperate. It was placed where someone wanted it to be seen. Not now, not soon, but eventually, the scholar's foe, to graft it in silence. No one spoke the name out loud. It felt wrong to give sound to something that had survived so long without it. They traced the lines with their eyes, imagining the hand that had cut them, imagining the moment when that person understood they were not meant to survive. This was not a signature, it was a rebellion, because Rome could erase cities, it could erase families, it could erase histories, but it could not erase the will of a single person who refused to vanish quietly. As the excavation deepened, they began to uncover signs that not everyone had accepted the silence. In one house, a hidden compartment behind a collapsed wall revealed objects wrapped in cloth that had long since turned to dust. Inside were tokens, jewelry, Small carved figures. Personal things. Things no empire could replace. Someone had tried to preserve identity in secret, knowing the city itself would not survive. In another room, they found marks on the door from the inside. Deep, uneven scratches. Not violent, not frantic, just persistent. As if someone had kept touching the barrier long after hope had ended, unable to accept that stone could become a final answer. The city was not only a tomb, it was a record of resistance. The deeper they went, the more they realized that Rome had not simply removed people. It had studied them. It had planned their disappearance with precision. The streets had been sealed in a pattern. Airflow had been cut deliberately. Wells collapsed in a sequence that suggested timing. Rome had wanted death to arrive slowly, quietly, without spectacle. There would be no screams echoing beyond the walls, no smoke rising, no sign that anything had gone wrong, only stillness. The archaeologists began to reconstruct the final days. They mapped where families had gathered, where elders had stayed, where children had been placed close to warmth that would never return. It was not panic, it was acceptance forced into shape. Rome had not only taken their lives, it had controlled the way they died. One researcher stood in what had once been a courtyard and whispered, "This is not a city, this is an execution method." And that was when the question shifted, not what happened here, but how often had it happened. Rome's records were detailed when it came to conquest. But absence had its own pattern, cities that appeared once and never again. Regions where population dropped without explanation, names that vanished between editions of maps. The erased city was not alone, it was only the one that survived long enough to be found. The scholars began to look differently at Roman history. They stopped trusting silence, they started treating gaps as evidence rather than accidents. Every missing name became a potential grave, and somewhere in those gaps, the person whose name was carved into stone waited to be understood. They searched the city for more. They found it in a room near the northern edge, a small chamber, almost hidden. Inside, against one wall, were dozens of marks, not decorative, not symbolic, counted days. Someone had been alive long enough to count them. The marks stopped at 47. No one knew if that was how long they survived or how long they could bear to remember time. But it was long enough to prove that Rome's erasure had not been immediate. It had been an experience, a slow crossing from existence into absence. And in that crossing, someone had chosen to witness. This was no longer about a city. It was about a voice that had refused to die when the body had no choice. Because when Rome buried this place, it had believed it was burying history. What it had really buried was a story that had been waiting for centuries to breathe again. And now it was breathing. The city's streets, now unearthed, were quiet witnesses. Dust and stone whispered of lives that had been measured in hours and days rather than decades. The walls still held the pressure of absence. Each doorway, each collapsed roof, each hollowed room was a record of what Rome had intended, invisibility. But the archaeologists noticed something that even Rome could not have predicted. Small inscriptions, faint scratches on walls, floors, and beams, almost invisible unless the eye lingered. Some were letters. Some were shapes that suggested counting, marking, remembering. Every mark was deliberate, every line a testimony, a human insistence that someone had lived here and that their life mattered. One scholar knelt in the sea, courtyard, tracing a pattern across the stone floor. It was not random. It was a map, not of roads or buildings, but of memory. Someone had marked where people had slept, where they had eaten, where they had huddled for warmth. Someone had refused to allow the city to vanish entirely, even when Rome had forced its slow death. Outside, the wind pressed against the excavation tents. It sounded like voices if you listened closely, murmurs of the long dead. The scholar shivered, not from cold, but from realization. Rome had thought it was erasing a city. What it had actually done was creating a stage for a story that would survive centuries, hidden in the earth, waiting to be found. And then they found the final room, a chamber beneath what had been the city hall. The entrance was almost invisible, concealed under centuries of rubble. Inside, the walls were lined with plaster. Names, faces, and events had been scraped off deliberately, but in one corner, a hand-sized patch remained. Someone had left it untouched. In the middle of that plaster, carved with trembling determination, was a single sentence: "We were here, we lived, remember us." The words were simple, but they carried weight centuries of oppression could not remove. Rome had tried to delete this city from history. It had attempted to erase its people, its streets, its name. It had thought that by sealing doors, collapsing wells, and removing bodies, it could silence a civilization entirely. But memory has a way of surviving, even when flesh and stone cannot. And in the hearts of those who uncovered the city, in the careful notes of the scholars, in the whispers of those who would study this story in decades and centuries to come, the city began to breathe again. It was no longer nameless, no longer erased, no longer silent. Because Rome may have destroyed the city, it may have buried it beneath earth and forgetfulness, but it had not destroyed the people who remembered, the marks they left, or the voice that refused to vanish. History finally began to speak. The ground itself, once complicit in silence, seemed to hum with remembrance. Every stone, every scratch, every fragment of plaster told the story of lives lived and stolen. The city was gone, yes. Its streets were buried. Its gates were bricked. Its waters choked. But it had left traces, and traces, when uncovered, can never be silenced completely. For even the most powerful empire cannot erase the will of humanity, and even in absence, memory remains. You've witnessed a city erased, a civilization silenced, and the power of memory that refuses to die. History is not always written in books. Times, it hides in shadows, beneath dust, beneath stone. Here, at Crimson States, we uncover the forgotten, the erased, the untold. If you felt the weight of this story, if the silence haunted you, subscribe, turn on notifications, and join us as we explore the dark corners of history, where the past still whispers and the forgotten demand to be remembered.